Okay, hello everyone. My name is Denise Rosendahl. I'm the Executive Director for ICE. Welcome to the conversation on the coronavirus. If you are having any technical difficulties, please be sure to send a note in the Q&A chat box and we will get someone to help you. We have muted everyone in order to avoid any background noise as we host our program today. We do appreciate you joining this very important conversation as we all attempt to navigate this very unprecedented time. And it is so heartening to see such a strong response. We have over 400 registrants just prior to this opening, and we already have 345 online. We do, of course, see that this is an important aspect of a professional community. And in fact, ICE really sees one of its most important roles is as a convener of the community to share knowledge and best practices and facilitate relationships. So to that end, I would ask that you don't view this time together as a webinar. We don't have any prepared PowerPoint presentations or an official curriculum. We have collected your questions, and there were about 36 of them submitted as of 5 o'clock yesterday in our online portal. We have assembled some very well-respected members to facilitate this conversation around the questions that you submitted. But this is your time together, and we do hope that you'll engage in the Q&A box with your questions. And of course, afterwards, at the end of our session, we will supply you with some additional resources that ICE is assembling. So let's get started. As I mentioned, I'm Denise Rosendahl, Executive Director for ICE for over the past 8 years. And my co-facilitator is Nick Soto. He is ICE's 2020 Chair of the Board of Directors. And Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am the ICE Chair this year, but I also represent a certification body, the Construction Manager Certification Institute. And I want to thank everyone for taking a few moments to be with us today and join this discussion. We have a lot of very important people on the call and a lot of very important industries we represent on this call, including healthcare and construction and various industries that all are very much impacted by this. And I know that everyone has a lot of concerns and questions. So I want to be sure that everyone understands that ICE is not here to push one way to solve problems or any of those kinds of things. We're here to provide options and allow a discussion of experiences and things that are going on right now that affect us. We all know that we're in an uncomfortable position. I mean, we may actually see my 6-year-old run by in the background here any minute now. So those are all things that we're all facing on a day-to-day basis right now. So we want to thank you for your time here and understand that we will answer as many questions as we possibly can. And if we need to, we'll do this again.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Okay, so just a few more ground rules for our time together. Again, everyone is on mute to avoid those background disturbances, and we will be relying heavily on the Q&A box for you to submit your questions and your comments. We only have an hour together, and we have a lot to cover, so we do ask that you keep your questions general. We won't be able to answer any specific program questions. Certainly you can reach out to the ICE staff and we can try to point you in the right direction, but we do ask that you keep your questions general so that folks on the call can benefit from your wisdom, your comments, your experience as well. Okay, so for those questions that were pre-submitted, I have grouped them into some topic areas and assign them out to some of our discussion leaders. Nick and I will alternate back and forth between some of these questions, and we'll be monitoring that Q&A. Okay, so our first area, not surprisingly, are questions related to remote proctoring. And we have asked Sarah Lake to join us. She is the CEO of the International Board of Lactation Consultant Examiners, and she's also our NCCA chair. As you may know, a communication went out last Friday from the NCCA to currently accredited programs about the Commission's decision related to the use of live remote proctoring. And Sarah, I know you want to review that decision with us, and we have a few follow-up questions after you are finished. So Sarah, would you bring us up to speed?
Sure, happy to do so, Denise. Nice to be with you, everyone. So as many of you know, the NCCA has been conducting a pilot with respect to live remote proctoring, and this was to occur and is occurring between January and June with 9 programs participating in the pilot. Then, of course, due to these exigent circumstances presented by COVID-19, inclusive of the closure of some major testing networks, governmental regulations such as many shelter in place, the NCCA has authorized a limited exception with respect to currently accredited programs. That are prevented from conducting in-person testing due to test center closures or governmental regulations such as shelter in place. Programs may, after careful consideration of potential effects on their particular accredited program, may choose to offer live remote proctoring during the period that in-person testing is unavailable. I think a definition, so we're all sort of on the same page, is very helpful here. To review, live remote proctoring is defined by the Commission as remote proctoring that occurs with a person actively watching and monitoring a candidate during the time of the test administration, and that provides safeguards for examination integrity and validity similar to in-person proctoring. So, with respect to this particular exception, the NCCA program that is currently accredited will not lose its accreditation if it complies with the following conditions, and the status will shift to accredited with compliance reporting. So, what are those steps that a program, if they wish to pursue this option, would take? They would submit an application to the NCCA before beginning the use of live remote proctoring. If the application is approved, the program will have a reporting compliance requirement. One late-breaking update, the application has been available, and approximately several programs have submitted. That application, as a result of an urgent meeting today held by the NCCA, will be slightly updated by the end of today. So stay tuned for those updates. In parallel, the pilot of remote proctoring will continue and hopefully accelerate. And the purpose of that pilot, again, was to determine whether the NCCA standards can be met using live remote proctoring, and if so, the conditions which must be met in order to comply with the standards. So, following issuance by the NCCA of its determination on live remote proctoring, accredited programs using, we'll just call it LRP, will have 60 days to submit a compliance report, indicating that they are complying with all of the conditions or that they have ceased using long-range proctoring, LRP. If the compliance report is not submitted or all of the required conditions are not met, the program is subject at that point to loss of NCCA accreditation. If the program ceases using LRP prior to the Commission's determination issuance with respect to the pilot, it still must report data and document it has ceased using long-range proctoring. If the NCCA does ultimately determine that LRP cannot meet NCCA standards, the Commission will notify programs of the phase out of this particular exception once major test centers have reopened and government orders have been lifted. Finally, programs must submit determination of timely discontinuation of LRP within 60 days of discontinuation. And the Commission will then review with compliance reporting that classification and remove it from a program's accreditation after confirmation of discontinuation. So that's an overview of this exception and the requirements associated with it with respect to live remote proctoring.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was very thorough. I have one question related to this decision and the process. How quickly are the applications being reviewed, and is there any kind of fast track? Is there any kind of prioritization?
Sure. This is the NCCA is taking steps to increase its bandwidth. At the same time, we do ask people to be patient. We will review them as quickly as we can. And as I said, by close of business today, if you go on the website, you will find the complete and updated application. It's very user-friendly. It's essentially a SurveyMonkey tool, and they will be reviewed in due course as quickly as possible.
Sarah, there's another question on here. There's actually two that tie into extensions and timeframes of how things are being processed. Are they going to be granting exceptions, and how those timeframes are working with NCCA right now?
Well, that's another great question, because Nick, for those who were planning or needed to apply reaccredit by April 30th, the Commission just approved within the last hour a 30-day extension. With respect to that, we know people are tending to their families and dealing with a lot of duties as CEOs or staff with respect to COVID-19. So there will be a 30-day extension for those who are in the regular cycle.
Great, thank you. Another question about the pilot program, Sarah. Are any of the pilot programs included that have initial certification for a licensure exam?
I am not absolutely sure of that. I can report back out, but I am not on that subcommittee, and I do not know if any of them have licensure embedded in their programs.
Okay. Here's another question. The compliance reporting requirements, will they be changed during the 60-day reporting period, or will they remain the same?
I think it's a little bit premature to state that, but what I can tell you is these have been very thoughtfully considered. With respect to the announcement last Friday, those were, pushed out, and a meeting was held of both the remote proctoring subcommittee as well as the Commission earlier today, and that's why the application is being updated. So I feel confident by the end of today we will have a thorough application process.
Great.
Sarah, there's a question in here about for those participating in the Proctor pilot for certification, is it necessary to submit an application for remote proctoring for additional accreditation for certifications?
I think that would be a question that would be best directed to the NCCA staff. I don't believe so, but I would defer to them on that particular point, and you can write them in the email.
Sarah, you're correct.
I hear Linda English. Thank you.
Okay, let's do just a few more questions on remote proctoring. The security concerns, not so much about cheating, but more about individuals capturing and sharing exam content. This is kind of generally now about remote proctoring. Any experience or tips that might be shared in terms of how to secure live remote proctoring?
I think when you look at the application that will be uploaded later today, the revised application, there's some information with respect to that particular piece, some technological opportunities that can be leveraged in this particular situation. And of course, I think one would wish to refer to the standards. There is some information that has been made available by the Commission with respect to the specific standards upon which one should focus if one is considering transitioning to LRP during this time.
Great. Another question, very interesting. What is the analysis of the pilot trying to answer? In other words, are you looking for equivalency, cheating, security, item harvesting, that kind of thing?
I think all of the above. I mean, obviously the focus is primarily upon security, comparability, and validity, of course. But I would refer you to those particular standards that are being made available. I think that that is a really good roadmap to answer those sorts of questions.
Okay.
I think this one is probably more for staff, but there's a couple of people asking for requests of people who are participating within the beta program, so that I guess they can probably talk to each other and bounce some ideas off each other. Is that something that ICE can do, Linda? Is that something our NCCA can do? I mean, there's security concerns around that as well, but it looks like people are looking to network somehow and figure the way through this process.
I would think, Nick, if it's with respect to pilot programs, I would recommend that they reach out to the NCCA staff in that regard. I certainly think that it makes sense for programs that are looking to proceed as newly adopting this remote proctoring option. I mean, obviously they can, you know, as you say, this is a community and bounce ideas off of each other. I would carefully look at the standards. And though the NCCA staff is, you know, great, they're going to be very busy. So I would actually recommend, it might be a great idea to sort of pull together some questions, and that would inform something like an FAQ document we could then push back out.
Great. I have just a couple of logistics questions to answer. We are recording this, and this will be posted in that resource area that we're developing. So you can download that as soon as that is posted. And this conversation is not just about remote proctoring. We have a few more questions, and then we're going to move on to other topics here shortly. Let's see. Nick, do you see any other remote proctoring questions that we should try to tackle today?
A lot of them have to do with the timelines and extensions is what I'm seeing a lot of, which I think Sarah kind of addressed, and I see that NCCA is being flexible in some of that, so that's good.
Could I ask, I apologize that I had to join a little bit late, but have you answered the question about if an organization is not accredited and offering live remote proctoring? Because that's when we've tended to get a lot.
I do see a question in here on that, so Linda or Sarah, if you wouldn't mind answering.
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for that, Linda. Absolutely. So this is for currently accredited programs. So currently accredited programs have already been vetted against the standards. There's an indicia that they are, you know, quality programs who are very experienced, and they have been well vetted. So at this time, the Commission felt very strongly that this should be available only to currently accredited programs.
And if you're not currently accredited, then that really becomes a business decision. I mean, obviously you have a lot of the same concerns around security and equivalence and protection of your intellectual property. But from the standpoint of the Commission, that then becomes your decision to weigh.
Linda, this is kind of specific, but I'm going to ask it because it's in their chat anyways. What if I've just submitted my application? Do I need to update the application?
If you have just submitted your application and it is under review at the current time and you are changing your policies that you've submitted, yes, that would be correct.
We've got some questions related to general tips for remote proctoring generally. I know that we're going to try to do a couple of programs later in the coming weeks, focusing on remote proctoring best practices. We do have a lot of webinars that have already been recorded around security and some other type of concerns. So we'll certainly point you to those resources. But any comments from our our discussion hosts about views or tips on remote proctoring? Anyone want to jump in?
I would just say that the major testing center vendors are a good source of information, and some of them offer different levels of remote proctoring. And so you should, if you have been using a testing center vendor and they are switching to remote proctoring, I would encourage you to talk with them about what assurances they are providing and what measures they are taking, and get information about that from them as you evaluate your options.
Great point, Julia. And just so you know, in our on our ICE website, there is a directory for vendors, and one of the selections of specialties is online proctoring. So you can go to that directory, and that would include ICE members in that directory, but you can select for online proctoring and get a list of those who are currently offering online products. Okay. We will continue to review the remote proctoring questions, and if we have time at the end, we'll come back and try to address as many as we can. But I do think it's time for us to move on to a more general business category, and this is related to business policies and practices that might need adjusting during this time frame. A lot of you are expressing concern around certificants or applicants looking for some adjustment in policies or deadlines. And so for that, we'd like to ask Julia to give her perspective on how flexible you might consider being with your policies.
Thanks. So I think of this issue as really falling into three buckets. One is deadlines that your policies and practices may have. The second is the substance of your product and requirements, eligibility requirements, what kinds of activities you require certifying individuals or certificates to engage in. And the third is the methodology of how you address these issues. With respect to deadlines, that's the area in which it's easiest to be flexible for the most part. None of us know how long this unusual period will continue. But depending on your program's rules and procedures, it may be that many of your certificates are in practice not that affected in terms of their ability to meet these requirements. For example, if you're on a 2-year certification cycle, those who have just met those certification requirements may not need to do anything until the end of 2021, when we certainly hope this is all over. And whereas others may have imminent deadlines. So one thing programs should consider is there a need to provide an automatic across the board extension, short-term, medium-term, long-term of any requirements? And what, if so, what subset of certificates or applicants you need to give that to? Or is this instead a situation where you can rely on existing processes for individuals to request an exception to your policy due to extenuating circumstances, with the recognition that this tends to be a genuine extenuating circumstance different from what we've encountered. With respect to the substance of certification requirements, I would think that certification programs should be very careful about changing those. For accredited programs, the substance of your requirements, how much continuing education, what your eligibility requirements are before you allow someone to take a certification exam, what the blueprint is for your examination, have been psychometrically validated or have been determined by your organization to be important in demonstrating that individuals meet the standards that your certification conveys to the public and to other stakeholders. For those programs that offer certifications that are relied on or recognized by licensure authorities, keep in mind that the decision about who can practice is not made by you. what you're deciding is, what does our certification convey? What does it mean? And then licensure authorities have the option to relax licensure requirements if they want, to allow provisional practice, for example, without there being a need for your certification program to alter the substance of what it means to earn that certification. Then the third bucket is methodology, and we've just been discussing that to some extent with respect to live remote proctoring. Certainly with respect to continuing education, many programs require at least some continuing education to be obtained in person. With the cancellation of mass gatherings and conferences, that's not feasible for most people anymore. And so giving some thought to whether you are suspending those requirements or whether you're going to start looking into what might be, at least on a temporary basis, an acceptable alternative that's available online. That kind of thought process and decision making will be very valued by your certificants and those seeking your certification. In addition, keep in mind that this does not have to be a forever decision. Just like NCCA's accreditation with reporting, the special exception that has now been approved for live remote proctoring is in existence for the duration that test centers are closed and won't necessarily be extended. You too can, in response to these exigent circumstances, say, this is what we're instituting now, but when our A standard expectations are available and feasible again, we're going to expect you to go back to those.
Julia, I failed to introduce you. Would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Julia Judish. I'm special counsel with Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman. We are outside counsel to NCCA and to many, many certification programs.
Great, thank you. And for the rest of our discussion hosts, when you speak, either to answer a question or when we get to your section, please do introduce yourself. There are a few questions online. I think this one was somewhat referred to in your comments, but certainly there's some sensitivity around the certificant population and their own finances. And so if a program is in the middle of a renewal cycle, charging that recertification fee may be sensitive for their population. Yes. Julia, do you have any comments? And I'd love to hear from some of the other folks if they have any practical considerations there.
Sure. So certification programs may already have fee waiver procedures, which could then be deployed for people who have lost access to income. Many don't, and especially if they are serving new certificate populations that have just graduated from a program and therefore are likely to just have debt as opposed to assets. But there certainly can be, and certification programs should consider whether there are ways to allow for payment plans or delayed payment in these times.
Great.
Julia, you might be able to answer this, but we may have somebody else in the audience who may be able to help with this too. This is a question that I'd like to know the answer to as well. It says, what reporting requirements will be required for documenting extensions given due to test center closures?
What reporting requirements should certifications require for documenting that they can't be met due to test center closures?
Right, extensions and things of that nature. So if we're requiring to cancel because of closures, what kind of extensions, requirements, and documentation wouldn't be necessary?
So each certification program can. Is this a question for NCCA for that application?
I think this is more along the lines of between NCCA and test centers. What documentation are we going to need as organizations to keep track of to help keep our programs aligned with what the test centers are going to require to avoid any fees along legally if we're required to keep any documentation, if any, on extensions being given.
So there should be an announcement from the test centers that certification programs are using, and that they should have access to that information. If you're using Pearson VUE or Prometric or PSI or another organization, they'll have told you that our test centers are closed in these geographic areas. Will have told the certification program. So certification programs can certainly consider in announcing any policies to their members that we know that we already have this information on the closure of the testing centers. So you don't have to go look for that and print it out and submit it. You can make it easier on your certificates that way.
Great. And Karen, you were going to jump in. Would you mind introducing yourself? Be sure to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay, I am unmuted. This is Karen Paz. I am the CEO for the National Board of Certification and Recertification for Nurse Anesthetists. And I wanted to make just a brief comment about the fees and the potential for reduction. We are currently going to launch our CPC four-year compliance check-in. And as a matter of fact, we are looking at the potential for reducing the fee short term. Our finance committee and board will weigh in on this. And the reason is that with the incredible challenges being faced by health providers, which nurse anesthetists are, in addition to the cancellation of many elective surgeries, trying to offer some type of incentive to our certificants, but more importantly, recognize what a challenging time this is.
Great. There was another question here regarding making any changes to policy or extending credential expiration dates or any other significant impact in policy. What will the annual report requirement be for an accredited program? So Sarah or Linda, you want to tackle this one? I'm assuming it needs to be reported in that annual report.
This is Sarah. Yes, absolutely. There is sort of a catch-all provision in the annual report where one discusses, anything unusual. It's very much a catch-all provision, and this would certainly be the place for that, to report on that. And like all things, I mean, what is the rationale? You want to explain with specificity what precisely was done, the underlying rationale for the same, for example, if it was a modification to policies, and document it that way, I'd say fairly briefly. Obviously, many programs are going to be going through very similar circumstances, but just simply keep provide documentation as to what the changes were, the rationale for the same, the decision makers, and when that was done.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, a question here about any legal requirements that need to be considered if there is a refund of registration fees through the candidate. Advise what documents are legally required from the candidates if refunds of registration fees were to be implemented.
So there's no legal requirement. Applicants are free to refund them. The one twist to that is to the extent that your certificants are paying their expenses as a business expense or have sought reimbursement from an employer for the certification maintenance or exam fees. You'll want to be sure that there's a documentation that you keep and that is provided as well to that individual to show that they've no longer incurred that expense.
Great. All right, other responses to business policies, changes, eligibility requirements, any other type of business practice that folks in the discussion host mode would like to respond to?
Yeah, I think, Denise, that we should probably go around the room for all the speakers that are on here to see what the temperature is in the room, because one of the questions here is the feasibility of an organization to extend credentials that expire during this time period, and what these organizations that are on the call are doing, so we can hear that and get a better sense of what's going on.
Great.
So why don't we start with Karen's the first person in my video. Karen, would you like to jump in on that?
Sure. Yes, thank you, Nick. And so in terms of our requirements for credentialing, first and foremost, what we have just done is to extend the application timeline through November for individuals to be able to get their continuing education credits because meetings have been canceled. So we have extended the deadline for this current year. Second, our initial certificates who are awaiting the opportunity to take our entry-level exam, they have not received their eligibility. And once the time frame for us as an organization being able to deliver that initial exam, we will look at whether or not we need to extend any eligibilities because of the capacity for testing.
Thank you, Karen. And Sarah, you're next up on my videos.
Sure. We're in a situation whereby we have two testing windows. And so April and September, essentially. So what we have done is obviously we're rescheduling the April candidates, date to be determined. And for the September candidates, we are going to be, in light of these circumstances, a little bit late opening, but we have extended the application window, pushed it further back as well. So that's something that we're doing. We're monitoring the situation very closely. As we all know, this is a very highly dynamic situation and it's hard to predict. We follow a calendar year and also have a fairly expansive certification cycle. It's 5 years. So we're kind of holding fast right now because we will need to have, there's things in, not for several months, and we're seeing what will be going on and listening to our stakeholders.
Thank you, Sarah. Bill, we haven't heard from you yet. Bill, why don't you introduce yourself and then let us know what you guys are doing.
Sure, thanks, Nick. I'm Bill Ellis. I'm the Executive Director of the Board of Pharmacy Specialties. So we're looking at a lot of the same things other groups are looking at, but the way we've done it in, if there's any suggestion here, is we've broken this down into our exam application process, our exam administration process, recertification, and then any fee collection, and kind of taking a deep dive in each of those areas to see where we might want to make changes. Like Sarah, we test on 2 windows, so we're looking at the expansion of those windows potentially as this really unfolds. One of the things on recertification, and we approve for a limited time, a limited number of providers, but we are monitoring the availability of recertification courses by providers because, as was mentioned earlier, some of these things may be canceled because they're live meetings. And so we have a shelf life on a lot of programs that we recognize for recertification. So we're looking at things like that shelf life and flexibility around those kinds of things. What we're trying to do in dealing with this is not underreact, but also not overreact either, because this is such a fluid situation. So I wish I had a great piece of advice, but that's kind of how we're framing it right now.
Thank you, Bill. And Lisa, why don't you introduce yourself and give us your input, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Sahlstrom, Vice President of Certification and Membership with the Association of Supply Chain Management. And we have a little bit of a unique business where 60% of our revenue for certification is actually outside of North America. And what we're fighting with right now, although we're moving to a remote proctoring platform for candidates worldwide, we are restricted in delivering remote exams in some embargoed countries like China and Japan, for example, where historically we've done business. So we're almost managing things on a country-by-country basis, taking into consideration the unique needs of each country, as well as not only making some blanket extensions for all of our candidates, but also taking into consideration the sensitivity of personal and individual situations where medical factors come into play, either an individual's own health issue or health issues with their family, and trying to work on a case-by-case basis to be as flexible as possible to get people through the testing process. It is a very, very challenging time. We're working triage to make sure that we're getting to all of our customers and candidates as quickly as possible, but I have to say we're pretty overwhelmed right now with the number of requests that we're getting.
Thank you, Lisa. And let's bring it full circle back to Julia and see if she has any input on legally what we can do, if anything, or if she has any perspective on this.
I realize that I left out one other consideration that may lead to needing to extend deadlines, and that is the capacity issue that was mentioned earlier, and that there may be either employees or volunteers on which certification programs have relied for test item generation, for disciplinary reviews, for processing applications, where the capacity isn't there because those employees are unable to, or have rights, unable to participate because the volunteers are not able to participate. There may be quorum issues to the extent there are committees, if the number of members are too ill to participate, which I hope doesn't happen, but certification programs just should be aware of these possibilities, that it may not be just the needs of your certificates and applicants, but your own organization's needs may lead you to have to slow down or extend timelines that you ordinarily are able to honor.
Great. There's a question here that I think could be generalized to many different aspects of eligibility requirements, but the question is specifically around waiving clinical competencies or other eligibility requirements for students due to the clinical site closures. A similar question to that relates to requirements of live training and willingness to go to remote training for those eligibility requirements. Any thoughts on that? Julie?
Yes. So, did you want someone else to answer that?
No, Julia, go ahead.
Oh, yes. So there are, those strike me as two different issues. The clinical skills requirement, that falls in your substance bucket, right? In terms of the kinds of actual training and competencies that you will be expecting your applicants and certificates to be able to demonstrate. So unfortunately, it may delay the timeline for some aspiring applicants to be able to apply for certification, just as school closures are delaying graduations and other things. And for that, again, it would go back either to the employers who are hiring these individuals or to the licensure authorities to decide whether they are going to provisionally relax their requirements, as opposed to certification organizations taking measures that mean that the validity of and significance of the credential is weakened. There isn't the same level of consideration for in-person versus remote training as we're experiencing right now. This kind of Q&A might ordinarily have happened in a large conference room, and now it's happening over Zoom. And hopefully the quality of the information being conveyed is no worse for wear.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. In the interest of time, I feel like we should move on to the next bucket of questions, unless anyone has any final comments. Okay, so we're going to move on to Bill, who's going to talk a little bit about changes in business revenue and expenses, what we might reasonably expect, what are some good best practices in a time of uncertainty around how to look at revenue, maybe how to reprioritize revenue streams, or even begin to cut down on expenses. Again, a business-related topic, but Bill, would you kick us off?
Denise, thank you for the softball question. I appreciate that. I would think of this in two buckets, really. One is more philosophical, right? I think in business in general, whether it's this kind of unprecedented challenge or other challenge, things that I personally have kind of relied on is that people are key. We got to take care of our staffs first and foremost, and then we got to take care of our customers and our certificates and our applicants. And we really have to make sure we don't lose sight of that, because without our staffs being taken care of to do this work, and without a focus on our populations that we serve, we're in trouble in business, whether it's COVID-19 or whether it's something else. So I kind of start there. And I think the people thing is important with relationships, because it was sort of alluded to before. If your certification is embedded as sort of a quasi-licensure, you need relationships with those programs to train people. You need relationships with those regulatory bodies that may be using your certification. So even though it sounds real obvious, it's a lot about people, and it's hard to, it's easy actually to lose sight of that when everything is kind of scrambled. So that's the first point. The second point, and again, nothing earth-shattering here. I wish I did have something that was earth-shattering. It's take a deep look and a deep dive into both your income and expense line items. And there's nearly no replacement for knowing those income and expense line items inside and out. On the income side, what things could be affected or could you potentially affect? So exam scheduling and registration, we heard about that before. You could expand or shift windows. We've talked earlier too about when might you want to consider using something like remote live proctoring. That may factor into your certification. We've also heard, I think Karen allude to some incentives or discounts or things like that that may help drive the business side. I would say flexibility in fee collection is important. Payment plans we've talked about, shifting deadlines, dropping late fees. The other thing that may or may not apply, and our organization doesn't have this, but some of you may have business interruption insurance, and maybe that comes into effect here. Those insurance policies are very tricky, and from what I do know about that, you're going to have to document, have a lot of data. On the expense side, I'd say, what are your major expenses? So what expenses could be delayed or deferred? What activities might be done differently? So today is an example, what can we do remotely? The thing that a lot of people say, but I have a little bit of concern about is, well, we're going to cancel this activity. Well, I think there's an important distinction between canceling something and maybe deferring something. And here's the point. You cancel something, it really begs the question, well, how essential is it anyway if you've canceled it? We may not be able to have that JTA or that role delineation study on March 24th because of what we're in, but most likely I'm thinking we're going to defer that to a later point in time. If we turn around and say, well, we're just going to cancel that, I really wonder, as we start to cancel things, how essential are they? And so that kind of leads to my third and final point. So what do we learn from this, right? This is a very difficult situation, but for me personally, it's got me thinking about the why of our certification. Why do we offer our certification? And that really, I know it sounds philosophical and I don't want to be academic, but why we do something is important, because that will help us inform the what and the how, and sometimes make answers to these questions maybe just a tiny bit easier. I wouldn't say easy, but a tiny bit easier, because you know why you're doing something. The other point I did want to make in just closing is, for both accredited programs, and I think it's a good business practice even for non-accredited programs, any change in policy, and I think Sarah might have alluded to this, you really should have a rationale. There's all kinds of reasons to have a rationale as to why you may change your standards. I think there's some legal defensibility element to it. There's certainly an element as it relates to accreditation. And again, you need to know why you may make a change. The earlier question had to do with some clinical stuff, and I know the Liaison Committee for Medical Education that accredits medical schools in the US and Canada has issued some guidance to medical schools on clinical activities that physicians are involved in. So there might be some other resources out there. So anyway, that's kind of the three quick things that I think about. People first, deep knowledge of your income and expense lines, and then the why of your certification. So again, I wish I could tell people if you do this or that, you'll automatically be able to maximize or preserve your revenues. I don't think it's quite that easy, but they're the three things I think about.
Great. Thanks so much, Bill. Great points. Thoughts, responses? Lisa, Karen, Sarah, Julia, Nick, anyone have additional thoughts to Bill's comments?
Denise, I think Bill is spot on, and this comes into really our discussion on reprioritizing staff and projects, and really taking a hard look at where we're spending effort, time, and resources. And is this really the right time to launch a brand new product? Or should we really double down and make sure that the products that we have today are addressing industry needs and are maintained effectively and can be delivered in the best way possible? So I think that is, we need to look at every aspect of our business right now and make those important decisions for long-term viability.
Great. Good point. There's a question in the Q&A box related to keeping our volunteers and SMEs engaged, especially if they're healthcare related and on the front line. And it might just tie into what you've just said, Lisa, which is, you know, we're in an unusual time. And so what are reasonable expectations for our volunteers and SMEs to be engaged without completely disrupting the work of the certification body? Any thoughts on that? Bill?
This is Bill. I think it's a really good point. I mean, we cannot exist in our industry without our subject matter experts. And I think knowing who's involved and what they're facing, are they first responders, frontline people, those kinds of things are critically important. So how do we always be sensitive to that? That may lead us to rework some things. One of the things that we have tried to do in our organization is we've tried to have at least one or two sort of pilot projects. And one of the pilot projects, very fortuitously this year, is to do a remote exam construction. We normally always do that face-to-face. So we had planned to do that as a pilot this year to see what we would learn. May turn out to be the way we're doing all exam constructions, but at least we had given some thought to that by doing those things and getting feedback from the volunteers as to what's going to work for them or not work for them. So stay close to people is really important.
Right.
Good point. Good point. Okay, I hate to shift again, but there's another important topic I feel we need to get to, and that is really what is the impact on your own operations, on your own teams, now that most of us are working remotely? Where are there shifts and reprioritizations that might happen? And Lisa and Karen are going to kick us off with this one. So are there impacts to the staff team that we should be considering as they shift to remote work? And are there roles that just can't be done remotely that need to be rethought? So Lisa, you want to start us there?
So when I take a look at what my organization has undergone, but we're now in our second week of remote work. And I think one of the biggest challenges and opportunities for us is to be more comfortable with technology. So looking at Zoom and Skype and MS Teams and your internet phone system, cloud services, Dropbox, all of those things that provide that first virtual team environment where you can share documents, but also have that face-to-face interaction where you're able to read body language. Now, this isn't perfect, but it is really becoming more acclimated, more comfortable with this new world that we are living in. And I think that's really important. As Bill mentioned earlier, relationships are key, and we don't want to lose that aspect of our relationship now. So making use of technology in every way possible to ensure that we still have those relationships is important. The other thing I think that we're facing also is that social distancing is taking a toll on everyone, and that feeling that we're isolated and that we have lost that team environment, which is really important to ensure that we're all working toward the same goal. And one thing I'll suggest also that we started implementing is once a week, we are doing a social or virtual happy hour where we're getting the whole team together on either a Zoom or Microsoft Teams meeting, and we're toasting each other on the great work that we've accomplished. Some people bring their dogs, and we're interacting in that team environment where we all know again that we're working together toward a common goal, and that's been really helpful. So it's looking at new ways of conducting our business differently while still maintaining that relationship that is really important.
Great point. And Karen, you want to talk about remote roles? Yeah.
Yes, remote staff and reprioritization. One of the examples that we have, first and foremost, with our new CPC program that launched, we're completing the first 4 years of the cycle. And in the next 4 years, there is an assessment that is required. And we had been conducting a pilot using review and record remote testing, and we also administering at a test center. So we have first and foremost put that assessment off to refocus our priorities on the initial certification exam, because for our national certification exam, we have just under 1,000 new graduates expected between April and June. We did administer a computer adaptive test, and now with the test centers closing, our staff is working on creating linear forms and coming up with potential alternative deliveries to include, I'll go use my colleague John Preston, going back to even paper and pencil, or to get computers set up in a hotel or in a university center, of course with the correct distancing, and administering some type of computerized proctored exam. So reprioritizing those, first and foremost, what's important, and that is to get individuals certified. Next, in terms going back to what Bill brought up and the volunteers, we did have some in-person meetings and have moved those to a remote setting. Again, looking at the time commitments, our exam meetings used to be a day and a half face-to-face in person. And we know that's really hard to try to do on a remote conference call. So looking at those alternatives. And more importantly, as Lisa said, keeping everyone engaged and to make that personal touch out there. We have department and teams meetings every day, and realizing this is a new norm for us and no one of us can predict. And I know at the time, I will stop there, Denise, and turn it back to you.
Thanks so much. We are right up against the hour, so we will need to conclude, but I want to say a hearty thank you to all of our discussion leads and to all of you for joining us. We will be following up with a resource link. It will be posted at ICE's website, credentialingexcellence.org/COVID-19. And everything we've been talking about will be posted here. A recording of this conversation will be posted there. Lots of other great resources. And if you have examples of things that you would like to share with the community, feel free to send that over to us and we will post that. We also have had some really great comments in the Q&A that we just can't get to, but some tips and thoughts from our attendees today that have shared perspectives, and we'll get all of these Q&A downloaded and posted as well. A huge thank you to everybody. This is just such an amazing community, and I really appreciate everyone coming together and sharing. And Nick, do you have any final closing thoughts?
Thank you again to everybody who's spent some time with us today, attending, participating in the chat, and to all of our presenters and speakers today. Continue networking, continue talking this through. We all need to learn from each other on this and be better at crisis management. Probably not something we often think about. So this is a reality check for a lot of us. So thank you, and I appreciate everyone being here today.
Great. Thanks so much. Have a great day.